The cold clods of earth made a sound like a final dull heartbeat as they struck the polished wood of the casket. Thump, thump, thump. Each one a punctuation mark at the end of a 50-year sentence. Elizabeth Vance stood motionless, a tiny, frail figure swallowed by a black wool coat that had belonged to a different life, a different woman. The wind was a bully whipping at the fabric of her dress and stealing the warmth from her skin, but she didn't shiver. She felt nothing but a profound, chilling stillness. It wasn't grief. Grief was a fire, a storm. This was the silent, hollow calm of an empty room after the storm has passed, taking all the furniture with it. This was the quiet click of a cage door swinging open. Her son Mark stood beside her, his hand a heavy proprietary weight on her elbow. He was performing the role of the grieving son with an almost theatrical perfection. His shoulders were slumped just so. A furrow was carved between his brows. Every few minutes he'd let out a shuddering sigh, loud enough for Mrs. Gable from 2 houses down to hear and nod sympathetically. He squeezed her arm. "It's okay, Mum," he murmured, his voice, a gravelly whisper meant for the audience of neighbours and distant relatives. "He's at peace now." Elizabeth didn't answer. She was watching his wife Chloe, who stood slightly behind them. Chloe's head was bowed, but not in prayer. Her face was illuminated by the sterile glow of her smartphone. Elizabeth could see the angle of the phone held low to capture her own grieving profile, the casket, and the grey, unforgiving sky in a single artfully composed shot. A masterpiece of curated sorrow. Elizabeth could almost imagine the caption taking shape under Chloe's manicured thumb, saying goodbye to a legend. Arthur Vance wasn't just my father-in-law. He was the heart of this family. Feeling so heartbroken but so grateful for the legacy he left behind. Number family first. Number legacy, number heartbroken, number the hearth will rise again. Asterisk. The last hashtag made a cold knot form in Elizabeth's stomach. Only Mia, her granddaughter, seemed to possess an authentic sadness. The girl stood apart from her parents, her young face pale, and tears streaked her shoulders, shaking with sobs that were silent and real. She wasn't performing. She clutched a single wilted rose. Elizabeth's gaze met hers for a fleeting second, and a question flickered in the old woman's mind. Who was Mia crying for? For the grandfather she thought she knew, or for the grandmother she saw standing on the edge of a fresh grave, about to be pushed in? The drive back to the house was a study in oppressive silence. Mark drove his knuckles white on the steering wheel of the ridiculously large SUV Arthur had insisted they buy. Chloe was in the passenger seat, tapping furiously on her phone, the quiet clicks echoing like tiny insects in the funereal quiet. No doubt responding to the flood of digital condolences, the praying hands emojis, the so sorry for your loss comments from people who hadn't seen Arthur in 20 years. Elizabeth sat in the back, watching the familiar scenery of Maple Creek slide by. The tidy lawns, the identical houses. A world Arthur had built, a world he had owned. A world that had been her prison. The house smelled of lilies and baked ham. A funereal potpourri. Neighbours had dropped off casseroles and platters of cold cuts, gestures of sympathy that now felt like provisions for the enemy. The air was thick, heavy, with 50 years of unspoken resentments, of swallowed words and stifled dreams. The furniture, dark and heavy and chosen by Arthur, seemed to suck the very light out of the rooms. For an hour they played their parts. Elizabeth sat in Arthur's wingback chair, his chair, and accepted condolences. People patted her hand and told her how strong she was. They told her what a great man Arthur had been, a pillar of the community, a business visionary. They used words like titan and patriarch. Elizabeth just nodded her face, a placid, unreadable mask. She felt like a ghost in her own home, an artifact left behind. Mark and Chloe moved through the dwindling crowd of mourners with practiced ease. Mark would clap a man on the shoulder, his face a mask of solemn gratitude. Chloe would air-kiss a woman's cheek, her voice a pitch-perfect hum of sorrowful grace. "Thank you so much for coming. It means the world to us." To Mom. Finally, the last car pulled away from the curb. The front door clicked shut, and the silence that descended was different. It was predatory. The performance was over. Elizabeth remained in the chair, her hands folded in her lap. She just wanted to go to her study, to the one room in the house that was hers. But she knew it wasn't over. This was just an intermission. Chloe was the one to break the silence. She glided over her heels, sinking into the plush carpet Arthur had been so proud of. She knelt before Elizabeth, taking her hands. Her own were warm and smooth, a stark contrast to Elizabeth's, which felt like ice. "Mom," she began, her voice, a confection of spun sugar and poison. It was the voice she used when she wanted something. "Mark and I have been talking. We've been so worried about you." Mark drifted over, hovering behind the sofa like a nervous shadow. He wouldn't meet Elizabeth's eyes. He stared at a point on the wall just over her head, his jaw working. With Dad gone, Chloe continued, her grip tightening slightly. "This house. It's just too much for you. The upkeep, the stairs, all the memories. It's not healthy for you to be here alone, rattling around in this big old place." Elizabeth said nothing. She just watched Chloe's face, the carefully applied sympathy in her eyes, the slight hungry curve of her lips. "We have a plan," Chloe said, her voice brightening as if she were unveiling a wonderful surprise. "A way to honor Dad's legacy and take care of you at the same time." Mark finally spoke, his voice strained. "The Hearth, Mom. The restaurant. It's been closed for too long. Dad, he always wanted to see it thriving again." Chloe picked up the thread seamlessly. "Exactly. It's his legacy. It's your legacy, Mark's legacy. We want to bring it back. A grand reopening. Make it better than ever. But that takes capital, a lot of it." Here it was, the blade unsheathed. So Chloe said, her voice dropping to a confidential whisper, "We think the best thing to do, the only thing to do, is to sell the house." The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating as the lily-scented smoke. Sell the house. Her prison, yes, but the only home she had known for half a century. The place where her daughter Mia was born. The garden she had secretly tended when Arthur wasn't looking. "And where would I go?" Elizabeth's voice was a dry rasp, the first words she had spoken in what felt like hours. Chloe's smile was brilliant, blinding. "We found the most wonderful place for you. It's called Maple Creek Senior Living. It's more like a resort, really. They have activities, a lovely dining room, on-site nurses. You won't have to worry about a thing. You'll be safe, cared for, caged, managed, put away. It's for the best," Mom, Mark mumbled, still addressing the wall. "It's the practical thing to do." The humiliation was a physical force. It pressed down on her, stealing the air from her lungs. She felt the blood drain from her face. These were her children, her son, and they were carving up her life before her husband's body was even cold in the ground. They were selling her home to fund a dream that wasn't even theirs, a legacy built on a foundation she knew was rotten. And then Chloe did something that tipped it all from mere cruelty into the realm of the grotesque. She pulled out her phone. With a practiced flick of her thumb, she opened an app. Elizabeth recognized the interface. TikTok. Chloe propped the phone against a vase of funereal flowers, angling it to get both herself and Elizabeth's stony profile in the frame. A little red light blinked on. She was recording. Chloe's face transformed. The saccharine smile melted away, replaced by a mask of pained, noble sacrifice. Her eyes glistened with manufactured tears. "Hey, everyone," she began, her voice trembling artfully for the camera. "I know today has been incredibly hard, but sometimes in the middle of grief, you have to make the tough choices. The choices that are best for the people you love." She reached out and patted Elizabeth's hand, a gesture that felt like a brand. Elizabeth didn't flinch. She just sat there, a statue of silent fury. "My beautiful mother-in-law, Elizabeth," Chloe continued, her voice catching. "She's been so strong, but we know this big house is too much for her now. So with heavy hearts, we've decided to help her transition to a place where she can be safe and cared for, so Mark and I can focus on rebuilding my father-in-law's legacy, the Hearth restaurant. It's what he would have wanted." She paused, letting a single perfect tear trace a path down her cheek. "It's the hardest decision we've ever had to make. But we always put family first." She looked directly into the lens, her expression radiating false integrity. Please send us strength. Hashtag family first. Hashtag legacy. Hashtag doing the right thing. She ended the recording and her face immediately snapped back to its usual bright, brittle hardness. She picked up the phone, her thumbs flying as she added the text and music. The humiliation was no longer a weight. It was a fire. A cold, hard, clarifying fire licking at the edges of 50 years of resignation. Elizabeth didn't scream. She didn't cry. She didn't protest. She simply watched them. She watched her son, who finally chanced to look at her, his eyes full of a pathetic cocktail of guilt and greed. She watched her daughter-in-law, who was already checking the likes on her post. She remained silent. Her silence was a void they couldn't fill, a question they couldn't answer. And in that silence, a decision was forged. They thought they were pronouncing a verdict. They had no idea they were declaring war. Hours later, the house finally settled into a deep and profound silence. The scent of lilies had become cloying, a sweet perfume of decay. Mark and Chloe had retreated upstairs, their low, excited murmurs about renovation budgets and menu concepts. A faint, insulting buzz from above. They had left a brochure for the Maple Creek Senior Living Facility on the coffee table. Its glossy photos of smiling, silver-haired residents playing bingo felt like a mockery. Elizabeth walked through the darkened downstairs rooms, her hand trailing along the spines of books. Arthur had never read the polished surface of a dining table where she had served 10,000 silent, joyless meals. She was a wraith in her own life story, but not for much longer. She made her way to the small room at the back of the house, the study. It was the only room Arthur had never shown any interest in. It was too small, too plain. It held no trophies, no monuments to his success. It held only her books, her thoughts, her one precious secret. She closed the door and turned the lock. The click was the sound of a vault being sealed, the sound of a different world coming into existence. She sat at the simple wooden desk and pulled an old, unassuming laptop from a drawer. It was heavy and scarred, its casing a dull, functional grey. It was completely anonymous. She booted it up. The screen glowed to life, asking for a series of passwords and passphrases. She typed them in from memory, her fingers moving with a swift, certain purpose. The familiar desktop was Spartan, holding only a single encrypted browser. She logged into a secure server through layers of digital protection. And on the screen, a new identity bloomed. A single word: Veritas. Here in the digital ether, she was not Elizabeth Vance, the frail widow, the inconvenient mother. She was Veritas. For the last 10 years, she had been the state's most revered and most feared anonymous food critic. Her blog, The Honest Plate, was a powerhouse. Her words could pack a new restaurant to the rafters for months, or shutter its doors in a week. Chefs and restaurateurs across the state spoke her name, in hushed tones, a mixture of terror and awe. They didn't know who she was: a disgruntled former chef, a reclusive billionaire, with a passion for gastronomy. No one knew. They only knew her judgment was swift, brutally honest, and always, always fair. This was her world, the only place her voice mattered, the only place she held any power. It had started as a hobby, a small act of rebellion against a husband who scoffed at her opinions on everything from politics to the seasoning in his soup. It had become her identity, her armor. She scrolled back, reading her last post published 2 weeks ago. It was a takedown of an overhyped, astronomically expensive bistro downtown that served foams and gels on slate tiles. She hadn't been cruel, merely precise. The deconstructed paella is an insult to both deconstruction and paella, she had written. It is a dish that has mistaken pretension for substance, a plate of beautifully arranged, lukewarm disappointment. The chef is a talented artist, but he seems to have forgotten he is cooking for people who eat not for a gallery of modern art. The restaurant's reservation numbers had plummeted by 40% overnight. She opened a new draft. The cursor blinked, waiting. She typed a title: A Final Meal. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. Was this it? Was she going to close up shop, sell her one weapon along with the house, and fade away into the beige, bingo-filled halls of Maple Creek Senior Living? The thought was a physical pain, sharper than any grief. To surrender this last vital piece of herself, It would be a death more complete than the one Arthur had experienced. Number, her jaw tightened. Her eyes, which had been dull with shock all day, now held a flinty, dangerous spark. She deleted the title. The words vanished from the screen. This was no longer about food. It had never really been just about food. It was about truth. It was about craft. It was about honesty. Everything her son and daughter-in-law were trying to build their future on was a lie, starting with the very restaurant they so proudly claimed as their legacy. The hearth. The battle had been declared tonight in her own living room. They thought they had chosen the weapons, money, real estate, and manufactured public image on TikTok. They thought she was unarmed. They were wrong. Her weapon wasn't her house or her savings or her good name. Her weapon was the one thing her family had never seen, never acknowledged, never even suspected she possessed. Her voice. The voice of Veritas. And the battlefield was the one place she was an undisputed master. A cold, clear sense of purpose washed over her, cleansing the humiliation and the fear. The frail widow receded. The critic emerged. Her fingers returned to the keyboard, moving with a new, resolute energy. This wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. It wasn't a review. It was a manifesto. It was the first shot in a war for her own life. She wasn't writing about a meal. She was about to cook one. And the main course, served cold and sharp as a shard of ice, would be the truth. The knock on the door was sharp, impatient. It wasn't Mark's hesitant tap or Mia's quick light rap. It was Chloe's knock. A summons. Elizabeth opened the door to find her daughter-in-law, standing there, a triumphant little smirk playing on her lips. Beside her stood a man in a grey suit carrying a leather briefcase. He had the kind of face that was deliberately forgettable, a professional blank slate. Chloe swept past her into the living room, her perfume filling the space Elizabeth was trying so hard to reclaim as her own. "Elizabeth," she said, her voice overly bright. "This is Mr. Garrison." He was Dad's lawyer. "Well, the family's lawyer. He has some documents to go over with you." Mark was already in the living room, standing awkwardly by the fireplace, refusing to meet her eyes. He just stared into the cold, empty hearth as if the answers were written in the soot. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Vance." "Mr. Garrison," said his voice as grey as his suit. He placed his briefcase on the coffee table and opened it with 2 precise clicks. "I am here to clarify the execution of your late husband's estate, specifically the Arthur Vance Family Trust." Elizabeth sat down in her armchair, her hands folded in her lap. She felt a familiar coldness seep into her bones. Arthur had loved legal documents, loved the power of fine print and binding clauses. He had always called it prudent planning. She had always known it was just another cage. Chloe sat on the edge of the sofa, leaning forward like a vulture, waiting for the final breath. "Just so we're all on the same page," she chirped. "For clarity." Mr. Garrison slid a thick-bound document across the table. As you know, Arthur was a meticulous man. He established this irrevocable trust over a decade ago to protect the family's assets. He named his son Mark Vance as the primary successor trustee. The lawyer paused, letting the words hang in the air. Mark shifted his weight, the floorboards groaning under him. Mr. Garrison continued, his tone flat, effectless. "The trust's primary assets are this property, the house, and controlling interest in the family business, the hearth, which, as you know, is set to be restructured and reopened." He looked at Elizabeth over the top of his glasses. "Put simply, Mrs. Vance, upon Arthur's passing, sole administrative control of these assets transferred to Mark." Elizabeth said nothing. She looked at her son. His gaze was still fixed on the fireplace, his jaw tight. He was a spectator at his own coronation. "What does that mean exactly?" Elizabeth asked, her voice quiet but steady. Chloe couldn't contain herself. "It means we can finally move forward, Elizabeth. We can sell the house, get the capital we need for the restaurant. It's what Dad wanted. It's his legacy." Mr. Garrison cleared his throat, a dry, papery sound. "To be precise," he said, tapping a paragraph on the page, "the trust stipulates that the successor trustee, Mark, has full discretionary power to liquidate, acquire, or otherwise manage all assets herein, including the sale of this residence." Elizabeth felt the floor drop out from under her. It wasn't a shock, not really. It was the final posthumous move in a 50-year chess game she had never been allowed to play. Arthur had checkmated her from beyond the grave. And for me, she asked the words, barely a whisper. Mr. Garrison turned a page. Arthur made provisions for you, of course. The trust allocates a monthly stipend for your care and well-being. He named a number. It was insulting. It was less than what she knew Chloe spent on handbags. This stipend, the lawyer added his eyes like chips of stone, is conditional. It is contingent upon your full cooperation with the trustees' decisions regarding the estate. The wording here is unobstructed cooperation, an allowance, a leash. He was gone, but his control remained coiled, in legal jargon wielded by her own son and the woman who despised her. Chloe stood up, smoothing her designer dress. So there it is, all above board. We've already had the house appraised. The market is hot. We can't afford to wait. She looked around the room at the furniture, the photos, the life Elizabeth had lived. Her gaze was like that of an exterminator's. We'll need you to start packing. The real estate agent wants to start staging in a week. 1 week. 7 days to dismantle 50 years. A week. Elizabeth's voice was hollow. It's generous, really, Chloe said, picking an invisible piece of lint from her sleeve. Mark and I have already put a deposit down on a lovely room for you at Maple Creek. It's very highly rated. They have activities. She smiled, a flash of white teeth. You'll be safe there. Cared for. Mark finally turned from the fireplace. His face was pale, his expression pleading. Mom, please, he said. His voice strained. Don't make this difficult. It's what's best. It's what Dad arranged. He was still his father's son. A weak echo of a powerful, cruel man. He couldn't see the bars of the cage because he was holding the key. Elizabeth looked from her son's weak face to her daughter-in-law's predatory smile to the lawyer's indifferent mask. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She felt a profound, terrifying stillness descend upon her. It was the stillness of the deep ocean just before the tectonic plates shift. She gave a single, slow nod. I understand, she said. Chloe's smile widened. She had won. Good, she said brightly. I knew you'd see reason. We'll send some boxes over tomorrow. She and Mr. Garrison left. Mark lingered for a moment, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. He wanted to say something. Absolve himself, perhaps. But he couldn't find the words. He just turned and walked out, closing the door softly behind him, leaving Elizabeth alone with the verdict. 1 week. The next day the boxes arrived. Flat-packed cardboard stacked in the hallway like a barricade. For 2 days, Elizabeth did nothing. She walked through the rooms of her house, not a home, but a museum of a life sentence she had just finished serving. She was overwhelmed not by grief for the past, but by the sheer weight of it. Every object was an anchor. On the 3rd day, she forced herself to start. She began in the living room, the public space, the stage where she had played the part of the happy wife for half a century. She picked up a small porcelain bird from the mantelpiece. She remembered buying it at a little antique shop on a rare afternoon to herself. When she brought it home, Arthur had held it up to the light, a look of disdain on his face. Another piece of clutter, Elizabeth. How much did this sentimental nonsense cost? He'd placed it on the mantelpiece, but in the back, almost hidden. She had never moved it. She wrapped the bird in newspaper and placed it in a box labeled Donate. She took down a framed photo of her and Arthur on their 25th anniversary. He was smiling at the camera, his arm draped possessively around her shoulder. She remembered that day. Just before the photo was taken, he had leaned in and whispered in her ear, "Try to look like you're enjoying yourself. My business partners are watching." Her smile in the photo was a rictus of strain. She stared at it for a long moment, then slid the photo out of the frame, tore it into 4 precise pieces, and dropped it into the trash. The emotional paralysis was a physical thing. Her limbs felt heavy, her breath shallow. The house was thick with ghosts, all of them with Arthur's voice. She moved to the dining room, remembering a dinner party where she'd offered an opinion on a political topic. Arthur had laughed, a booming sound that made the guests titter nervously. "Oh, Elizabeth," he'd said, patting her hand, "don't trouble your pretty little head with such things. That's man's talk." He called it womanly nonsense. She had burned with a silent, helpless rage. The shame still felt hot on her cheeks decades later. She packed the good china, the silver, the crystal glasses he had insisted on, but which she had always been terrified of breaking. Each piece felt heavy with the memory of silent, tense dinners, where the only sound was the clinking of cutlery and Arthur's pronouncements on the world. Days blurred into a haze of packing tape and memories. She was drowning in the past, in the accumulated weight of 50 years of being made to feel small, foolish, and worthless. It was a prison far more effective than any legal trust. Her own mind was the warden. On the 6th day, with only 1 day left before Chloe's deadline, she finally forced herself to face the one room she had been avoiding Arthur's study. It was his sanctuary, a mahogany-panelled fortress of leather and smoke. Even now it smelled of him, of old paper, expensive whiskey, and a faint, lingering scent of cigars. She had rarely been allowed inside. It was his space, his world. Her opinions, her presence, were not welcome here. The room was exactly as he had left it. A pen lay next to a neat stack of papers on his enormous oak desk. The chair was pushed back as if he might return at any moment to resume his command. For a moment she was frozen at the doorway, the old fear, the ingrained conditioning holding her in place. Asterisk. Don't touch anything on my desk, Elizabeth. Asterisk. His voice sharp and cold in her memory. Then a new feeling pushed through the paralysis. A flicker of something hard and defiant. This was no longer his desk. It was no longer his house. It was a crime scene, and she had 1 day to gather the evidence of her own life before it was wiped clean. She walked to the desk. Her hand trembled as she reached out and touched the polished wood. It was cool, smooth, impersonal. Her fingers traced the edge. This desk had been the throne from which he had ruled their lives. From here, he had signed the checks, made the calls, drafted the legal documents that had bound her so tightly. She started clearing it. Bills, business correspondence, old calendars. Nothing of any consequence. She opened the drawers. Pens, paper clips, checkbooks, the mundane tools of a meticulous man. She worked methodically, her movements becoming less hesitant, more determined with each drawer she emptied. This was not packing. This was an excavation. She ran her hand along the underside of the desk, then along the ornate trim on the front. Her fingers brushed against a small section of carved oak that felt different, not quite flush with the rest. She pressed it. Nothing. She tried to slide it. It gave just a fraction of an inch with a faint click. Her heart started to beat faster. It was a sound she could feel in her throat. She worked her fingernails into the tiny gap and pulled. A small, narrow panel of wood swung inward, revealing a dark, hidden compartment. She stared into the recess, her breath catching. What would be in here a secret that contradicted the trust? Love letters from a hidden affair, some final cruel joke. Her hand, shaking again, reached inside. Her fingers closed around not paper but something solid wrapped in leather. She pulled it out. It was a small, handsome book, its dark green leather worn smooth with time. There was no title on the cover. Beside it, tucked deeper in the compartment, was a set of old, cloth-bound accounting ledgers. They were dated 1975. She carried them over to the leather armchair by the window, the last of the afternoon light slanting through the dusty air. She set the ledgers aside and opened the leather book. The pages were filled with elegant, sloping handwriting. It was a passionate, hurried script full of life and flourishes. It was not Arthur's cramped, precise penmanship. She knew this handwriting. Her blood went cold. It was a ghost from a lifetime ago, before Arthur, before the wedding, before the long, slow suffocation of her marriage. A tremor went through her, a shock that started deep in her soul and radiated out to her fingertips. Julian Croft. Her first love. The boy with ink stains on his fingers and dreams of being a chef. The boy she was supposed to marry before he'd left town, suddenly broken-hearted. and broke, leaving her to the sensible match her parents had arranged with the ambitious, promising Arthur Vance. She turned the pages, her vision blurring. It was a recipe book. But not just any recipes. Her breath hitched. Seared scallops with saffron risotto, duck confit with cherry reduction, the hearth's legendary chocolate lava cake. They were all here. Every single signature dish that had made the hearth a local institution. The dishes Arthur had always claimed as his own genius, the old family recipes he had supposedly modernized. It was a lie. All of it. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the book. Arthur hadn't created anything. He was a businessman, not a chef. He couldn't even boil an egg properly. She had always known that, but she had accepted the story, like she accepted everything else. It was easier than asking questions. Now the questions were screaming in her head. With a sense of dread, she reached for the ledgers. 1975. The year the hearth opened. The year Julian disappeared. She opened the first one. It was a standard accounting book, columns of numbers, detailing expenses and profits for a new business partnership, Vance and Croft. She read on, her heart pounding a sick, heavy rhythm against her ribs. The first few months showed a modest profit. Then the numbers started to get strange. Large, unexplained consulting fees paid out to shell companies Elizabeth had never heard of. Inflated invoices for supplies. A steady, systematic siphoning of funds from the business's account into a personal account belonging to Arthur. The second ledger told the rest of the story. It detailed a fraudulent buyout. Arthur had used the stolen funds to create the illusion that the restaurant was failing. He had presented Julian with cooked books showing mounting debts and no way out. There were notes in Arthur's own handwriting in the margins, cold and calculating. Jay is desperate. Offer 10 cents on the dollar for his share. Pressure from suppliers, my contacts will force his hand. Final offer accepted. He leaves town tomorrow. It was all there, in black and white. A meticulous record of a cold-blooded betrayal. Arthur hadn't just built a business. He had stolen it. He had stolen Julian's dream, his recipes, his future. He had driven his partner into bankruptcy and run him out of town, a broken man. And then he had married the woman Julian loved. The book and ledgers slipped from her lap and fell to the floor. The room seemed to tilt. 50 years. She had lived 50 years inside a lie built on a stolen heart. Her marriage, her home, her son's inheritance, it was all the fruit of a poisoned tree. The legacy Mark was so desperate to protect was nothing but a monument to a thief. Arthur hadn't just stolen a restaurant. He had stolen her life. The life she was supposed to have. The happiness she might have known. The grief was a physical blow knocking the air from her lungs. She grieved for Julian, for the talented, passionate boy she remembered. And she grieved for herself, for the young woman who had believed she was abandoned, who had settled for a life of quiet servitude, because she thought her great love had simply left her behind. The grief lasted for a long, shuddering moment. Then something else rose up through it. It was cold and clear, and hard as diamond. It was rage, a pure, clean rage that burned away the last vestiges of fear and worthlessness. She was not a victim. She was a witness. And these books, this was not just evidence, this was a weapon. She picked them up from the floor, her hands perfectly steady now. She knew she couldn't do this alone. She was a 72-year-old woman with a meager stipend and a 1-week eviction notice. They would dismiss her. They would say she was confused, grieving, senile. Chloe was already planting that seed. She needed an ally, someone who saw the world through a clearer lens, someone who understood the new rules of this game. There was only one person. She walked out of the study, leaving the door open for the first time in 50 years, and picked up her phone. She scrolled through her contacts and pressed the name. It rang twice before a bright young voice answered. "Grandma, is everything okay?" Elizabeth took a breath. "Mia," she said, her own voice sounding strange to her ears, stronger than it had in years. "I need you to come over." "Now," Is it Mum and Dad? Did they say something else? Mia's voice was instantly protective. Just come, Elizabeth said. And Mia, come alone. Don't tell your parents you're coming here. There was a pause on the other end, and then I'm on my way. 20 minutes later, Mia was there, her young face etched with worry. Grandma, what is it you look different? Elizabeth led her not to the living room but to the dining room table. She switched on the overhead light, creating a stark pool of illumination in the dim house. She placed the leather recipe book and the old ledgers on the polished wood. Your grandfather, she began, her voice low, and even built his entire life on a story. Tonight I found out that story was a lie. Mia looked from her grandmother's intense face to the objects on the table. She opened the recipe book first. Her brow furrowed in confusion as she looked at the unfamiliar handwriting. This isn't Grandpa's, she said. No, Elizabeth replied. It belonged to his business partner, a man named Julian Croft. She watched as Mia's eyes scanned the recipes, her sharp mind making the connection instantly. Mia looked up, her mouth slightly open. The hearth. These are all the famous dishes. The ones Dad always talks about. They were Julian's, Elizabeth said simply. Then she pushed the ledgers toward her. And this is how your grandfather got them. Mia, the journalism student, opened the ledgers. She read in silence, her expression shifting from confusion to disbelief, and then to a slow dawning horror. She traced the columns of figures with her finger, her breathing growing shallow. She read Arthur's cold, methodical notes in the margins. She saw the whole ugly story unfold in the faded ink. When she finally looked up, her eyes were blazing. The worry was gone, replaced by a furious, protective anger that mirrored the fire Elizabeth felt in her own chest. He stole it, Mia, whispered her voice, shaking. He stole everything. The whole thing. All of it. Yes, Elizabeth said. And they? My parents. They want to sell this house to build a new restaurant on that. On a stolen legacy. The words came out in a rush of indignation. They talk about honoring Dad's memory, about his hard work. They were going to put you in a home while they live off a foundation of lies. Mia stood up and began to pace the dining room, her hands clenched into fists. I always knew something was off. The way they talk about money. The way Mom is so obsessed with appearances. The way Dad acts like he's constantly trying to live up to something that isn't even real. She stopped and looked at her grandmother, her eyes full of a new, fierce clarity. This isn't just about the past, Grandma. This is about right now. They're still profiting from it. Elizabeth felt a wave of relief so profound it almost buckled her knees. She had not been wrong to call. This was not the heartbroken girl who cried at the funeral. This was a young woman with a spine of steel and a keen sense of justice. They won't listen to me, Elizabeth said. Chloe is already telling people I'm confused. Let them, Mia, said her voice hard. We don't have to talk to them, we have proof. She tapped the ledgers. I'm a journalism student, Grandma. I know how to dig. I know how to find things. People don't just disappear. Not anymore. Julian Croft has to be somewhere. He has family. He has a story. She pulled out her phone, her thumbs flying across the screen. And my parents' finances, I bet they're not as clean as they pretend. Dad's always been careless with digital security. A grim, determined smile touched her lips. He's about to find out his daughter pays attention in her cyber journalism class. Elizabeth looked at her granddaughter, at the fire in her eyes, and for the first time since Arthur's death, she felt a flicker of something she had long thought extinguished forever. Hope. What do we do? Elizabeth asked. Mia looked up from her phone, her expression set. First, we get these documents copied and stored. Somewhere safe. Somewhere online. They can't touch. Then I start digging into Julian Croft and the current state of the hearth's finances. You need to play along. Let them think you're defeated. Let them think you're packing. Mia came and stood in front of her, taking her grandmother's hands in her own. They've underestimated you for 50 years, Grandma. Let's not correct them now. Elizabeth looked down at their joined hands, one wrinkled and worn, the other young and strong. An alliance. A secret. The embers of a long-dead fire were beginning to glow, and she knew with absolute certainty they were about to start a blaze. The glow of the laptop screen was the only light in Mia's small apartment, reflecting in her wide, determined eyes. On one half of the screen was a secure video call, a small still image of her grandmother's face, etched with a calm that was more unnerving than any anger. On the other half were the weapons of their war, neatly organized into a single devastating folder on her desktop. She clicked it open. Dossier. Hearth of Lies. Inside, the digital ghosts of the past were marshaled for a final charge. There were the high-resolution scans of Julian Croft's recipe book, the faded blue ink of his elegant script, a stark contrast to the cold digital format. Each page was a testament to a stolen dream. Next to them were the ledgers. Mia had spent nights poring over them, her journalist's mind, tracing the flow of money, the fraudulent entries, the precise, methodical way Arthur Vance had bled Julian's business dry before buying the husk for pennies on the dollar. It was a masterclass in quiet treachery. She had compiled her own evidence too. A separate subfolder contained screenshots of supplier invoices from the past month. Mark and Chloe were cutting corners, swapping out artisanal cheeses for mass-produced blocks, prime cuts of beef for cheaper, lower-grade meat, organic vegetables for conventional produce. Yet the menu prices, which she'd also documented, had only gone up. It was a different kind of theft, a modern one, but it stemmed from the same rotten root: greed. The centerpiece of the dossier was the article. It was already written, formatted for the Veritas blog, a platform with a reach that could topple giants. The headline was simple, brutal: "The Hearth, a legacy built on stolen fire." The text laid out the whole story, weaving together the evidence from the ledgers, the heartbreak of the recipe book, and the modern-day grift of Mark and Chloe. It was cold, factual, and irrefutable. All it needed was the final command. "Everything is ready, Grandma Mia," said her voice, a low murmur. "The post is drafted. The evidence is embedded. I have a list of every major food journalist, blogger, and media outlet in the state. The moment you give the signal, I'll send the link to all of them. It will be everywhere in minutes." On the screen, Elizabeth nodded slowly. She was in her small, temporary apartment, the one that felt like a waiting room for the rest of her life. She was already dressed. A simple, elegant dark coat, a soft wool hat that could be pulled down to shadow her face. She looked like any other elderly woman, anonymous and easily dismissed. It was the perfect camouflage. "Chloe's Instagram is..." Something else. Mia added a note of disgust in her voice as she scrolled through her phone. "She's posting a new story every 10 minutes. Number The Hearth Reborn. Number Vance Legacy. Number Michelin Bound." She snorted. She even tagged Gordon Ramsay. "The delusion is breathtaking." "Let her," Elizabeth said, her voice steady. "The higher she builds it, the harder it will fall. Pride is a fragile foundation." A new email pinged in Elizabeth's inbox, the notification. A quiet chime in the tense silence. She opened it. The subject line was stark: "Your invitation, the grand reopening of the Hearth." It was addressed to E. Veritas, the pseudonym she had used with the burner email account. She had it. Her ticket to the execution. "I'm confirmed, Mia," she said. "The invitation is here." "Okay," Mia breathed, her fingers hovering over her keyboard. "Okay, I'll monitor everything from here. I've got network monitoring tools running. The moment the blog post goes live, I can track its spread in real time. I'll be your eye in the sky." "You are more than that, my dear," Elizabeth said. And for the first time, a flicker of deep, raw emotion crossed her face. "You are the proof that not everything in this family was poisoned. You are the truth." Mia swallowed hard, nodding, unable to speak. "I'm leaving now, Elizabeth," said her voice, returning to that unnerving calm. "There's no turning back." "You don't have to do this alone, Grandma. I can come. I can wait outside." "No," Elizabeth said, her tone absolute. "This is something I have to face myself. You have done your part. Now it is time for me to do mine. Be ready." The video call ended, plunging Mia's room back into the solitary glow of the screen. She looked at the drafted blog post one last time. It was more than an article. It was a verdict. A lifetime of silence, of swallowed pain, and quiet humiliation was about to find its voice. And it would be a roar. Downstairs, Elizabeth pulled the soft wool hat lower on her brow as she stepped out into the cool night air. The taxi she'd ordered was waiting. As she settled into the back seat, she gave the driver the address of the hearth. The name tasted like ash in her mouth. She didn't feel vengeful. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt like a force of nature, like a storm that had been gathering for 50 years, finally ready to break. The revenge wouldn't be served hot or cold. It would be served as it was made, with the dispassionate, unavoidable certainty of a debt coming due. The hearth was no longer the warm, inviting restaurant she remembered from a lifetime ago. It was a monument to ambition glittering under the cold, white glare of architectural lighting. Valets in crisp red jackets hurried to open the doors of luxury cars, the street lined with BMWs and Teslas. A red carpet, cordoned off by velvet ropes, led to the heavy oak doors. Through the vast plate glass windows, Elizabeth could see a sea of people, men in sharp suits, women in glittering dresses, all holding flutes of champagne, their faces masks of practiced social grace. Elizabeth paid her driver and stepped out onto the curb, a small, dark figure at the edge of the spectacle. She walked past the line of arriving guests, her simple coat and shadowed face rendering her invisible. She didn't approach the main entrance. Instead, she walked to a side door, the one reserved for staff and deliveries, and presented her phone to the single bored-looking security guard stationed there. The screen showed the invitation for E-Veritas. The guard grunted, scanned the QR code, and waved her in without a second glance. She was in. She entered a bustling corridor, the air thick with the smell of cooking oil and frantic energy. Chefs in white coats shouted orders. Wait staff balanced trays, their faces tight with stress. Elizabeth moved through the chaos like a ghost, her steps silent and sure, until she found an archway leading into the main dining room. She slipped through it, finding a quiet alcove near the back, partially hidden by a large, grotesque modern sculpture Mark had probably paid a fortune for. From here, she could see everything. It was a charade, just as she'd expected. She watched Chloe, a vision in a tight, sequined dress, glide through the room. Her smile was blinding her hand, constantly clutching a champagne flute as she moved from one group to another, her laughter, a little too loud, a little too shrill. She was in her element, the queen of a kingdom built on lies. Elizabeth saw Mark trailing in her wake, his suit expensive but ill-fitting, his shoulders hunched. He looked less like a host and more like a hostage, a desperate, sweaty sheen on his forehead as he shook hands and forced smiles. Elizabeth's gaze drifted to the food being paraded around on silver trays. Tiny, pretentious bites passed off as haute cuisine. She watched a well-known investor pop a canapé into his mouth, a single scallop on a smear of green puree. She knew that scallop. It wasn't the sweet diver-caught scallop from the coast that Julian's recipe demanded. It was a cheaper frozen import, its texture rubbery, its flavor bland. The puree wasn't made from fresh spring peas. It was from a frozen bag, the taste dull and watery. They were serving a lie on a silver spoon, and the guests, blinded by the glamour and the free-flowing champagne, were swallowing it whole. A woman with aggressively styled hair and a phone clutched in her hand, like a lifeline, stood near Chloe. Elizabeth recognized her instantly from Mia's research. Juniper Finch, a food blogger with 500,000 followers, known for her gushing, easily bought praise. "Chloe, darling, it's just divine," Juniper exclaimed, gesturing vaguely at the room. "The energy is electric, and the food, you've truly honored your father-in-law's legacy. He would be so proud." Chloe's smile widened, a predatory flash in her eyes. "Oh, Arthur was a visionary," she said, her voice dripping with counterfeit sincerity. "Mark is just so determined to take his father's dream to the next level. We're not just a restaurant anymore, Juniper. We're a brand, a destination." As Chloe spoke, her eyes scanned the room, a hostess checking on her party. Her gaze swept past Elizabeth's alcove, then snapped back. The brilliant, practiced smile froze on her lips. Her eyes narrowed, the color draining from her face, replaced by a blotchy red tide of pure fury. The champagne flute tilted in her hand, spilling a few drops onto the polished floor. Juniper Finch noticed the shift. "Chloe, is everything all right?" Chloe didn't answer. She excused herself with a clipped one moment and began to stalk across the room, her sequined dress shimmering like angry fish scales. Her path was a direct line to Elizabeth's hiding spot. The whispers and laughter of the party seemed to fade into a dull roar in Elizabeth's ears. The moment had arrived. Chloe stopped a few feet away, her body vibrating with rage. She kept her voice low, a venomous hiss that was more menacing than any shout. What in God's name are you doing here? Elizabeth didn't flinch. She simply looked at her daughter-in-law, her expression unreadable under the shadow of her hat. I was invited. Invited. Chloe's laugh was a short, ugly bark. Don't be ridiculous. You are not welcome here. This is an important night for us. For your son, and you show up like this, dressed like a bag lady trying to ruin it. I have no intention of ruining anything, Elizabeth said calmly. I'm merely an observer. An observer. Chloe's eyes darted around, checking if anyone was watching. A few heads had turned, their curiosity piqued by the tense tableau. Her panic mounted. You're delusional. You need to leave. Now. She craned her neck, her eyes searching frantically. Security! She called out, her voice rising in pitch. Security over here! Mark, who had been trapped in a conversation with a city councilman, saw the commotion. His face went pale, a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. He started moving towards them, his steps hesitant, as if wading through cement. Two burly men in black suits, their earpieces glinting, began to make their way through the crowd. Their faces were impassive, professional. Chloe, what's going on? Mark stammered as he arrived, his eyes pleading with his wife, with his mother, with anyone who would listen. Chloe ignored him, her focus entirely on the approaching guards. She turned to the small, growing circle of onlookers, her expression shifting in an instant from rage to one of deep theatrical concern. Her voice became soft, sorrowful. It's my mother-in-law, she explained to the concerned faces, including the rapt and recording Juniper Finch. She hasn't been well since Arthur passed. She gets confused. She wanders. She placed a hand over her heart. She's having an episode. It's just so tragic. The lie hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Elizabeth watched as the expressions of the people around them changed from curiosity to pity. They looked at her not as a person but as a problem. A poor, confused old woman who needed to be managed to be removed. Mark stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing silently, a fish drowning on dry land, paralyzed by a lifetime of weakness, caught between his mother's silent dignity and his wife's vicious public lie. The security guards arrived, their large bodies blocking out the light. One of them took a half step towards Elizabeth. Ma'am, he began, his voice firm, but not unkind. I'm going to have to ask you to come with us. Elizabeth didn't move. She didn't look at the guard or at the pitying faces of the crowd or at Chloe's triumphant sneer. She lifted her head, the shadows falling away from her face, and looked directly, unequivocally at her son. The years seemed to melt away, and for a fleeting moment, he wasn't a failing businessman in an expensive suit, but a small boy looking to his mother for guidance. Her voice cut through the murmurs, clear and steady, a single sharp note in the cacophony of lies. Mark, don't do this. It wasn't a plea. It was a command. The two words landed with the weight of 50 years of motherhood, of shared history, of a bond that Chloe's ambition could not completely sever. The security guards paused, their professional certainty wavering in the face of a family drama they were not equipped to handle. The crowd fell silent, sensing this was more than a confused old woman. Mark flinched, as if struck. The facade of the ruthless businessman, the heir to the Vance legacy, shattered into 1,000 pieces. All the bluster, all the borrowed confidence drained away, leaving behind a terrified, broken man. He saw his mother standing small and frail, but with a spine of steel, about to be publicly humiliated, dragged out of his restaurant like a common trespasser. He saw the gleam in Chloe's eyes, the cold satisfaction. He saw the pity on the faces of the investors he was so desperate to impress. It was all crashing down. "Mom, please," he begged, his voice cracking the sound, raw and desperate. He took a stumbling step forward, his hands outstretched in a gesture of supplication. "Please just go, quietly. We can talk about this tomorrow." "There is no tomorrow," Mark. Elizabeth said, her voice still level, still devoid of heat. It was this coldness that unnerved him most. "Don't ruin this," he whispered, his plea now directed at her alone, the rest of the room forgotten. His eyes were wet with unshed tears of shame and frustration. Please, it's all I have. It's my one chance to make this work to be something. It's all Dad left for me. It's his legacy. The word hung in the air between them. Legacy. The final emotional appeal. The invocation of the father he'd spent his life trying to please. The pull of a mother's pity for her floundering, pathetic son. For a heartbeat, Elizabeth felt it. A pang of that old familiar instinct to soothe, to protect, to sacrifice her own dignity for his. She saw the little boy who used to scrape his knee and run to her for comfort. She saw the teenager who failed his driving test and wept in frustration. She saw the man before her, a hollow echo of his father's worst traits, drowning in his own inadequacy. And then the moment passed. The pity curdled into something hard and final. The image of Julian Croft's stolen recipe book flashed in her mind. The memory of Arthur's casual cruelty. The 50 years of being a ghost in her own life. This wasn't about her son's feelings anymore. This was about the truth. Her eyes, which had held a flicker of maternal softness, hardened into chips of ice. She looked at her broken son not with pity, but with a profound and terrible clarity. He left you nothing, she said, her voice cold and clear. Each word, a perfectly formed shard of glass. It carried across the silent room, reaching every corner, every investor, every blogger, because he had nothing to give. She paused, letting the weight of the statement settle. Mark stared at her, his face a canvas of disbelief and horror. It was never his. With that final devastating pronouncement, Elizabeth broke eye contact with her son. The invisible thread that had bound her to his weakness, to her own silence, snapped. She was free. She turned her back on him, on his collapsing world, and faced the stunned audience. The small, frail woman in the dark coat seemed to grow in stature, her presence suddenly commanding the entire glittering room. Her voice, which had been so clear and cold now, rose with a strength that no one, least of all her own family, had ever heard from her. It was the voice of Veritas. My son, she began, her voice ringing with an authority that silenced every rustle of fabric, every clink of glass, speaks of his father's legacy. He speaks of the hearth, as if it were a monument to Arthur Vance's genius. She reached into the deep pocket of her coat. The movement was slow, deliberate. Every eye in the room followed her hand. Chloe, who had been frozen in a state of shocked fury, seemed to reanimate. A new primal fear contorted her features. No, she breathed. No, you don't. Elizabeth's hand emerged, and in it she held a small, worn, leather-bound book. It was old, its cover softened with age, its pages yellowed. It looked insignificant, ancient, a relic from another time. But in that room it felt like a bomb. This, Elizabeth declared, holding the book aloft for all to see, is the true legacy of the hearth. This is its heart. This is its soul. Her voice dropped, becoming a low, dangerous growl. And it was stolen. A collective gasp, a single unified intake of breath rippled through the room. The silence that followed was absolute, heavier than anything Elizabeth had ever known. Chloe lunged. It was a clumsy, desperate movement, all sharp elbows and flailing limbs, her sequin dress catching the light as she tried to snatch the book from Elizabeth's hand. "Give me that! You're insane!" "She's lying," but Elizabeth was ready. She simply took one step back, and Chloe, propelled by her own frantic momentum, stumbled past her, nearly falling. The security guards, caught completely off guard, moved to restrain her. The image was stark, the glamorous hostess screeching and clawing, being held back like a common brawler, while the quiet old woman stood untouched, holding the truth in her hand. Elizabeth's gaze swept over the shocked faces of the investors, the bankers, the food critics, and the socialites. Juniper Finch's phone was held high, its camera lens a single unblinking eye recording every second. This book, Elizabeth continued, her voice cutting through Chloe's frantic shrieks, was written by a man named Julian Croft. A brilliant chef. A good man. He created every recipe that made this restaurant famous. It was his genius, his passion that filled these pages. She opened the book, its spine cracking softly in the cavernous silence. And he was ruined. By my husband. Arthur Vance destroyed his business, stole his work, and left him with nothing. He built his entire life on another man's dream. She looked up from the book, her eyes finding Mark, who was standing as still as a statue, his face ashen, his world reduced to rubble around him. My son is right about one thing. This is about legacy. But it's Julian Croft's legacy. A legacy that was buried for 50 years. She paused and delivered the final, most personal blow. Julian Croft was the man I was supposed to marry. The shock in the room was palpable, a physical force. It was a scandal, a tragedy, a drama, more compelling than any dish they could have served. At that exact moment, hidden in the folds of her coat, Elizabeth's thumb pressed a single button on the cheap burner phone in her pocket. It was a simple preset command. A silent signal shot out into the night. Down the street, sitting in the driver's seat of her parked car, Mia saw the notification pop up on her laptop. A single word, now. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her hand was steady. She took one last deep breath. Her cursor hovered over the bright blue button on the screen. It was labeled with a single powerful word, publish. She clicked it. It began not with a shout, but with a hum, a low electronic vibration that spread through the room like a contagion. One phone, then 3, then 10. A dissonant chorus of pings, chimes, and buzzes from purses and pockets, heads that had been turned towards Elizabeth's mouths, agape at her declaration, now bowed down, thumbs swiping across glowing screens. The air, thick with shock just a moment before, was now charged with the electric current of information traveling at the speed of light. A man in a tailored suit, a potential investor, let out a soft gasp. My God, it's from Veritas. The name hung in the air, more potent than any accusation Elizabeth could have made on her own. Veritas. The kingmaker. The executioner. On dozens of screens, the same headline blazed in a stark, unforgiving font. The hearth, a 50-year-old lie. Asterisk. Asterisk. Below it, Elizabeth's story unfolded, not in the halting voice of a grieving widow, but in the clean, surgical prose of the state's most feared critic. There were no emotional pleas, only facts laid out like evidence in a murder trial. Scanned images of Julian Croft's elegant, looping handwriting from the recipe book, the faded blue ink, the notes in the margins detailing a pinch, more salt, a touch less sugar. Then the damning pages from Arthur's ledger, crisp digital photographs of the fraudulent entries, the diverted funds, the systematic financial strangulation of Julian's dream. The blog post read like a final verdict. It methodically dissected the evening's meal, the one Chloe had curated with such painstaking pretension. Asterisk. The amuse-bouche asterisk. One guest read aloud in a hushed, horrified whisper. Asterisk, a deconstructed version of the hearth's classic tomato bisque, was an apt metaphor for the evening. All style, no soul. It lacked the depth, the patient simmering of flavours that was once the hallmark of this establishment. It was a pale imitation, a ghost of a memory served in a shot glass, a fitting tribute, perhaps to a legacy built not on culinary passion, but on theft. Asterisk. As the article was being absorbed, a second wave hit. A different kind of notification. TikTok. Twitter. A push alert from a local news channel. Mia had unleashed her own storm. The hashtag number Hearth of Lies was trending. It wasn't just trending, it was a vertical line shooting up the charts. Videos began to play on the phones held in trembling hands. Mia had intercut Chloe's soulless, hashtag-laden promotional videos with scanned images of the evidence. There was Chloe posing with a filter pouting about number family first and number carrying on the legacy, immediately followed by a stark close-up of the ledger, proving Arthur had stolen that very legacy. There was Mark in a carefully staged interview talking about his father's vision, cross-faded with Julian Croft's stolen recipes. It was a masterpiece of digital assassination, brutal in its elegant simplicity. The energy in the room shifted irrevocably. The invited media, the local news crews and food bloggers who had come for a puff piece on a family restaurant's grand reopening suddenly smelled blood. Their professional apathy vanished, replaced by the keen, predatory glint of a breaking scandal. Lenses that had been focused on the new decor and artfully plated food now swiveled like gun turrets towards Mark and Chloe. Microphones were thrust forward. The polite questions about flavor profiles were gone. Mr. Vance, is it true your father stole the restaurant? Chloe, can you comment on the fraud allegations? Is Veritas, your mother Mark, number half of lies? What's your response? Mark didn't hear them. He was frozen, a statue in the eye of the hurricane his mother had summoned. His gaze was locked on the small leather-bound book in her hand. That book. He remembered seeing it in his father's locked drawer as a child, being told it was the family's sacred text. His entire identity, the proud son, the inheritor of a respected legacy, the man who was finally stepping out of his father's shadow to honor him, it was all tied to that book. And his mother held it like it was a piece of trash. His eyes slid from the book to Chloe's face. The mask of the grieving, supportive wife had shattered. Her carefully constructed expression of dignified sorrow had curdled into a mask of pure feral rage. Her face was pale, her lips a thin, bloodless line. The foundation of his life wasn't just crumbling. It had been revealed as a sinkhole he'd been standing on for 48 years. The man he had spent his life trying to emulate was a thief. The business he was about to helm was a crime scene. His marriage, he suddenly realized with sickening clarity, was a business transaction that had just gone bankrupt. While Mark imploded in silence, Chloe exploded in sound. Lawsuit! She shrieked, her voice cracking high and shrill. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger at Elizabeth. You are finished. We will sue you for slander. For defamation, you senile, old witch. You've lost your mind. She lunged towards a blogger who was live streaming. The entire meltdown, her face, a contorted mess. Turn that off. Turn it off. You have no right. Her voice, usually so measured and media-trained, was now a raw, desperate howl. It was the sound of her ambition dying, of her carefully curated online persona being burned alive in a public square. But it was useless. Her screams were just another clip in the viral storm, another piece of content for the number Hearth of Lies campaign. The flashes from the cameras were relentless, capturing every twitch of her unraveling sanity. The sound of her threats was completely drowned out by the incessant, triumphant chiming of 100 phones, each one a nail in the coffin of the world she had tried to build. Elizabeth simply stood there, watching the inferno she had ignited, her expression unreadable. She didn't need to say another word. The truth served cold was more than enough. The days that followed were a quiet apocalypse. The viral firestorm did not die down. It consumed everything. National news outlets picked up the story of Veritas, the vengeful critic who was also the founder's wronged wife. It was a story too perfect to ignore family betrayal, a secret identity, a 50-year-old lie, and a public takedown of spectacular proportions. The Hearth was finished. The health department didn't need to shut it down. The public had already condemned it. Reservations were cancelled en masse. The phone rang only with calls from reporters or threats from online trolls defending Chloe, a dwindling and pathetic army. The restaurant, which had been buzzing with life and false promise just a week earlier now, sat dark and silent, a tombstone marking a fraudulent legacy. Fraud investigations were launched not just by the press, but by the state attorney's office. Arthur Vance, once a local hero, was being posthumously disgraced. The fallout tore through the Vance family with surgical brutality. Chloe was the first to go. There was no tearful goodbye, no dramatic confrontation. Elizabeth learned about it from Mia, who had seen Chloe's new defiant Instagram post a selfie from an airport lounge, a glass of champagne in hand, captioned asterisk. Sometimes you have to burn the bridges to clear your path. On to bigger and better things. Mia later found a transcript of the divorce filing online. It was swift and merciless. Chloe cited irreparable reputational damage and financial malfeasance on Mark's part, as if she were a victim of his family's lies, not a co-conspirator in their perpetuation. She left him with the mountain of debt from the restaurant's relaunch and the full weight of the public shame. Mark simply broke. He didn't rage. He didn't plead. He collapsed into himself. The strong, confident air was gone, replaced by a hollowed-out man who had lost his past and his future in the same night. He sold what he could, which wasn't much, and retreated into the silence of the big empty house, a ghost rattling around in a different kind of prison than the one his mother had just escaped. The family wasn't just destroyed, it had been revealed as a fiction all along. Elizabeth watched all of this from a distance, a quiet observer of the wreckage. There was no triumph in her heart, no gloating smile on her lips. She had expected to feel a surge of victory, a satisfying burn of revenge. Instead, she felt a profound, aching quiet. It wasn't the silence of emptiness, but the silence of a great weight being lifted. The noise of 50 years of resentment of swallowed words and buried truths had finally ceased. Her work was not done. This was never just about tearing something down. It was about building something back up. "Mia," she said over the phone, "one crisp autumn afternoon, I need you to find someone for me." Another villain, Grandma Mia's voice, was bright, filled with a new kind of confidence. The Number Hearth of Lies campaign had become a case study in her digital media classes. "No," Elizabeth said softly. "A victim. I need you to find the family of Julian Croft." Mia's journalistic instincts, now finely honed, took over. She spent 2 weeks buried in digital archives, ancestry websites, and public records. It was a difficult search. Julian had died childless, and seemingly without close relatives. But Mia was relentless. She traced a cousin who had moved to Oregon, who had a daughter who had then moved to Arizona. Finally, she found her a single name on a property deed in a small town outside of Phoenix: Sarah Croft, a grandniece, a retired schoolteacher in her late 60s. Elizabeth and Mia made the call together on speakerphone in Elizabeth's quiet study. A cautious, slightly wary voice answered. "Hello, Miss Sarah Croft, Elizabeth," asked her own voice steady. "Yes, who is this? My name is Elizabeth Vance. I knew your great-uncle Julian Croft a very long time ago." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Uncle Julian, no one's asked about him in my lifetime. He passed away before I was born. My mother talked about him sometimes, said he was a wonderful cook who had some bad luck in business." "It wasn't bad luck," Miss Croft, Elizabeth said gently. "It was theft." Another silence, this one filled with confusion. Elizabeth, with Mia's quiet encouragement, told her everything. The story of the restaurant, the stolen recipes, the fraud. She left out the personal betrayals, the story of her own heart. This wasn't about her. It was about Julian. A week later, Sarah Croft flew to Maple Creek. She was a woman with kind eyes and the same elegant hands Elizabeth remembered on Julian. They met not in a cold corporate office, but in a small neutral law firm Mia had found. The room was quiet, smelling of old paper and fresh coffee. Mark was not there. Chloe was not there. It was just Elizabeth, Mia, Sarah, and their respective lawyers. Elizabeth didn't make a grand speech. She simply pushed a portfolio across the polished wooden table. "These," she said, her voice clear and firm, "belong to you." Inside was the legal transfer of the trademark for the Hearth name. Another document assigned full ownership and all rights to the collection of recipes in Julian Croft's book. And finally, a certified check. It was for a significant sum, the majority of the money from Arthur's liquidated estate, the money Mark and Chloe had tried to claim. It was enough to be life-changing. Sarah stared at the documents, her hands trembling slightly as she touched the check. Her eyes filled with tears. I don't understand. Why would you do this? My late husband built our life on a crime he committed against your Uncle Elizabeth," stated, her gaze unwavering. "I lived in that life for 50 years. I profited from it, whether I knew the whole truth or not. This is not a gift. It is a restitution. It is me finally paying a debt that is long overdue. It was not an act of revenge. Revenge is a hot, messy, selfish thing. This was cold, clean, and selfless. This was justice." As Elizabeth signed the final page, she felt the last chain of her old life fall away, turning to dust. She was no longer a Vance in any meaningful way. She was just Elizabeth. And for the first time in half a century, that felt like more than enough. The house sold quickly. To Elizabeth, it wasn't a home filled with memories. It was a museum of a life she hadn't chosen, a beautifully decorated prison. She walked through its empty rooms one last time, the echo of her footsteps the only sound. She felt no nostalgia, no sadness, just the quiet relief of a sentence commuted. Handing the keys to the realtor felt like dropping a heavy stone she'd been forced to carry for miles. She didn't look back as she drove away. She didn't stay in Maple Creek. The town was too small, too full of ghosts and whispers. With the money from the sale of the house, her money finally and truly, and the surprisingly substantial income that now flowed from the Veritas blog, which had become a national sensation, she bought a small two-bedroom apartment on the 34th floor of a glass tower in Chicago. It was the opposite of her old house in every way. The walls were white, the furniture was modern and minimal, and the light was everywhere. Floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over the sprawling, energetic cityscape. The constant, distant hum of the metropolis wasn't a disturbance. It was a lullaby of life, of possibilities. It was the sound of anonymity, the sound of freedom. A month after she moved, in a month spent exploring new neighborhoods, discovering tiny hidden bakeries, and simply sitting by her window watching the world move, she received an email. The subject line was simple. Checking in. It was from Mia. Elizabeth clicked it open. Grandma asterisk. I hope Chicago is treating you well. I hope you found at least one bakery that meets the Veritas standard. Asterisk. I wanted to let you know I officially declared my major today. It's no surprise, I guess. Investigative journalism. Asterisk. Asterisk. I've been thinking a lot about what you did, not just at the restaurant, but afterwards, with Sarah Croft. It wasn't just about exposing a lie. It was about making things right. You taught me that the truth isn't just a weapon, it's a tool for restoration. Thank you for that. Thank you for everything. Asterisk. So, I have to ask. The blog has been quiet for a few weeks. The whole world is waiting. Who's next, Veritas asterisk? Love asterisk, Mia. A slow smile spread across Elizabeth's face, the first truly unburdened smile she'd had in years. She looked away from her laptop screen out at the endless city lights that glittered below like a fallen constellation. A landscape of new stories, new restaurants, new truths waiting to be told. Each light was a possibility. She took a slow, deliberate sip of her cooling chamomile tea, the warmth spreading through her. She set the cup down on a simple coaster, the soft click echoing in the quiet of her new home. She placed her fingers on the keyboard, the plastic cool and smooth beneath her skin. She was not the ghost of Arthur Vance's wife. She was not a prisoner in a perfect house. She was Veritas. She was Elizabeth. She was free. And she began to type.